Hello everyone, welcome to another Animation Friday. I apologize that this video has to be uploaded late. Unfortunately, I've been relatively busy throughout this week, but I should be caught up by the end of today. So without further ado, for this particular Animation Friday, I thought it would be interesting to dive into something that I am personally not all too familiar with, but is one that I have been exposed to at least throughout my childhood and have had at least a little bit of exposure to. Um, and these are a list of, in particular, popular anime shows. Now, these shows that I'm going to be addressing, and again, in case anybody doesn't know exactly what anime is Japanese cartoons. I am definitely not the biggest fan of anime. I mean, I have watched some anime over the years, not a huge extent, but a little bit, and I find a lot of the scenarios a little bit too out there and strange for me. Although I do think that they do offer some very interesting insights as far as various concepts are concerned, and I think definitely anime has had an influence, especially within Western culture, at least I think starting within the 90s. And it has sort of crossed over, and I've definitely seen its influence and its impact. And that's why I sort of wanted to address ones that at least are not only familiar to me, but ones that I knew were really popular and did get a lot of exposure, at least um, within my childhood. So I'm not basing this list off of my personal favorites because I don't really have personal favorites. I kind of like to just sort of watch anime on and off because it's just not for me. I can understand that it is definitely for other people, and I totally get why some people gravitate more towards anime and that kind of style and culture. But for me personally, it just doesn't fit with me all too well. Um, I think it's not only due to the way in which a lot of the animation looks, but also because I just feel like a lot of the stories I don't really personally identify with, but I think there is a lot of interesting content that exists within it. So even though I don't really like anime as a whole, I still appreciate it and think it's offering some interesting insights into things. It's just not, I think it's just more of a taste thing. Like it's something that I can delve into once in a while, but to really get devoted and invested into it is just something that I do not have the time for and probably don't have the patience for to do. So, especially since anime is such an extensive genre. I mean, it's like a subgenre of animation. I mean, it's very extensive and there's a very huge library. And a lot of it does stem from sort of the manga or the comic kind of books, as well as I think video games too, especially considering Japan has been heavily influenced by video games. At least a lot of their culture has stemmed through technology, in particular video games. Um, so without further ado, let me address the ones that I think had the most relevancy, or at least from what I was exposed to, and sort of, figure out if these are some shows you're familiar with or ones that you've been exposed to or enjoy. So, without further ado, let me address the first one, Fullmetal Alchemist. Now, this one is a more adult um, anime cartoon show. It's a little bit more darker and a little bit more in depth. So it's not like the kinds of other shows that I'm going to be talking about that are a little bit more kiddish. This one is a little bit more kind of philosophical, I guess you could say, in certain respects, and it also dives into certain concepts that might be a little bit more heavier than what you would generally expect compared to some other anime television shows. Um, and Basically, in case you're not familiar with this particular show, it involves two brothers, one named Edward Elric and the other named Alphonse Elric. And basically, they end up losing their mother from some sort of incurable disease, from what I could gather. And basically, they want to revive her. And in doing so, they basically use this sort of forbidden, they get, from my research, it's like a human transmutation to sort of raise her from the dead. So um, you can kind of think of it as like, Frankenstein in certain respects, creating life out of death. Um, but ultimately this backfires because when they go through this human transmutation, they end up losing parts of their body. At least Edward, the older brother, ends up losing parts of his body, but his brother ends up losing his entire body. But he somehow manages to put to have his brother's soul implanted into this like robotic body. And so so again, this is anime going weird on me sometimes, and this is why I kind of just go, okay. I mean, I know this is an interesting concept, but sometimes it's like, why would you put him in a robot? I mean, couldn't you put him in something else? I don't really understand. So it's kind of, it's fairly bizarre. I mean, already from the way in which the animation looks, you can tell it's a little bit wacky and out there. And again, that's why I think a lot of people like anime, because it is so goofy sometimes and strange. But basically, when that happens, when he again puts the soul inside a robot, and the robot that is his brother, I guess his brother's soul into the robot, they realize, okay, we need to fix this mess that we got ourselves into. So Edward decides basically to enroll in the military, and I guess this means that once he enrolls in there, the military in particular, I guess, has access to this um, alchemical, um, I guess, substances, or at least something that is of alchemy. Hence the title Fullmetal Alchemist. And basically his whole goal is to really return his brother back to normal. And in doing so, going through this process, he ultimately, at least within the plot, there ends up being a war coming. So as a result of this, the brothers sort of kind of question their morals. There's a lot of things that end up happening within the show, at least, that make it so that they sort of question their values and their loyalty, and sort of kind of, I guess, how far they're willing to go to, I guess, kind of become back to where they were before they carried out this experiment to revive their mom. And I think there's a lot of reasons why this show resonated with people, and I think it did sort of a little bit resonate with me, at least initially when I was kind of a little bit exposed to it. Because even though, again, there is the wacky kind of stuff of, putting the soul in the robot, and, having the one limb that's, carried off and replaced with, robotic stuff, and then all this talk of like alchemy and, just kind of the weird, wacky things are just, again, they're just a little bit too out there for me personally. But what I really do like about what this series is trying to address is the whole concept of, life and death. The similar things that, books like Frankenstein, other series that have explored this kind of a concept of sort of the living dead, like heck, even The Walking Dead, so to speak. The whole idea of, kind of constantly having to try to survive and trying to find a sense of, I guess you could say, peace, as well as, a sense of closure, I think, too, because I think in a way, you know, the way for them to kind of come back to normal is kind of, you know, also a way of, you know, sort of letting their mom kind of, you know, go as well, because they know that that, you know, that obviously there's really no way to, you know, at least revive her, considering the fact that it didn't work the first time. So I think there's a lot that this show brings to the table as far as discussing the whole concept of loss uh, and of death, and how, you know, people sort of end up dealing with it, and how sometimes, you know, the lengths we're willing to go to kind of, you know, break that supposed cycle, so to speak. Which is kind of what Edward is at least is trying to do with his brother, because technically his brother is dead, really. I mean, he's alive in the sense that he has a soul, but at the same time, his soul isn't a robot. I mean, he's not an actual person, so it's kind of it's very strange in that sense. But again, it is bringing up some interesting ideas, and I think that in a way, there is a lot of tragedy within this particular series. And although I think anime does address tragedy over and over again, I like the fact that in this one it's relatively interesting in the way in which it addresses it, because you do feel like that there is this sense of, you know, them trying to kind of come to grips with the situations that they end up finding themselves in. Um, so at least from my standpoint, in regards to the show, I think that, you know, it is one of the more serious anime television shows, and I think it's one that a lot of people, at least from what I remember, do remember significantly, and it's gotten a lot of critical praise. It's considered highly among anime television shows, so I think it only makes sense that they would have this one be so prominent, at least within the United States. I think this one in particular was, and sort of remains, kind of prominent. Um, and also, there was sort of like a spin-off I think they did afterwards. I think it's called Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, if I'm not mistaken. So they do kind of they did kind of expand it further, and tried to uh, go into the similar concepts that the first show kind of talks about, and sort of brings in this philosopher's stone to the whole plot, which you will sort of see presented if you choose to watch that particular part of it, at least television series. But I think that's really ultimately all I can address about this particular show, without really giving too much away, and also giving you a sense of its popularity and what it's really about. Now, the second one I'm going to address is kind of on a different lines than Fullmetal Alchemist, at least from what it's trying to address. And that's Dragon Ball Z. Now, this one is actually a sequel to Dragon Ball, but I think a lot of people in particular remember, at least within the United States, from what I could tell, they do remember Dragon Ball Z. And this one is a little bit, I think, cheesier, at least for my taste. It's a little bit goofy, and I think sort of people, I guess, liked it for that. But it's very popular, at least from what I can remember of the boys of my generation. I think I can remember all the boys being like, Dragon Ball Z, testosterone. You know, it's just so over the top sometimes, you know, in that sense that, you know, I think it makes sense that why it would be more of a boys television show. But again, obviously there's, you know, people that are of the opposite or the same gender of myself that enjoy this particular show. But I think, at least from what I could tell, I felt it was a little bit more on the boyish side, or at least was trying to appeal to that particular demographic. But basically, the television show revolves around this guy named Goku. who basically learns that he's from another planet, and technically, I guess speaking, he's a warrior, and basically he and his friends are basically uh, throughout the television show trying to defend the planet from these extraterrestrial supposed enemies. So basically, they kind of duke it out with the enemy, which in this case is supposedly supposed to be like aliens and whatnot. Um, so yeah, it's pretty much as wacky and again goofy. Like again, anime. There's always something very strange about anime to me. They always have to put something odd in there, like really just out of whack out there. At least for the most part. But this particular show inspired memes, actually. There was a particular meme that was going around about Dragon Ball Z that ended up becoming very popular for some reason. Because I guess people thought it was funny, so again, it becomes a meme. There was also, I think I remember from what I could tell, a lot of merchandise, a lot of things that were sort of marketed to kids, in particular boys, in regards to Dragon Ball Z. And the main character is really buff. I mean, these people are like gigantic, monstro, like just over the top. And I think that's why, in particular, little boys liked it so much because it was so, so in your face, and I think in particular boys like that kind of a thing. Um, Me, since I'm a girl, not so much, but I can totally understand the appeal. It's and the thing that uh that I think unfortunately may have kind of skewed at least the, I guess, credibility, unfortunately, of the television show was unfortunately a movie that they made about that revolved at least around what was going on within the television show. Yeah, and I think unfortunately a lot of people, especially people who were like really big fans of this show, really got angry at this movie that they tried to pull from it, unfortunately. But um, I think the reason why, though, I think not only does it appeal to, I think, the boys for being very over the top, um, but it's also very fast paced. Like you feel the animation is like really in your face. You do feel like it's very action packed. It's very, you know, it's just Japanese. I just don't know how else to describe it. It's just very Japanese. It's just like yeah, and woo and ha, and just it's just boo, 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 all over the place. And I think that makes sense though, especially when you consider, various martial arts that are um, related to the Japanese culture and how that would, sort of kind of be a part of their animation. And, you really do feel that the characters sort of convey that, at least within, I think, this series, from what I can tell. So they really do try to up the ante within this television show. And I feel like it's a lot more goofy. It's a lot more it's not taken as seriously as something like Fullmetal Alchemist. So I think that's something that's important to note. I think Fullmetal Alchemist was largely more designed to be a little bit more on the dramatic side, whereas Dragon Ball Z is very, action oriented. It feels kind of, again, it feels a lot like, all of these other action packed movies uh, like Fast and Furious uh, and Die Hard. They feel very, there's just a lot of action. It's just a lot of fast paced movement. And I think that's why there was a genuine appeal to it. Especially in particular, I think largely for little boys. Although I will say, yes, there's obviously exceptions to the rule. There's obviously girls out there that probably did enjoy this show. But at least from from my standpoint, I noticed from my experience that mostly boys were interested in this show, and they talked about it to me all the time. So yeah, I think that's although ultimately I can say about Dragon Ball Z, it's a little bit more straightforward, I think, and definitely delivers as far as what you would expect from a show like that. The next one that I'm going to mention is also, again, not only popular, but rather interesting. And again, I think it also did have some kind of merchandise to it. Um, I remember when anime was like kind of the rage for like some kids, at least within my middle school, and I think they would actually wear stuff that was related to like the anime television shows. Not for me. I wouldn't be caught dead wearing anything that's supposedly even related to anime. But again, I can understand the appeal. That show being Naruto. Now Naruto is kind of interesting because it basically follows the struggles of three young ninjas that are sort of in the training process. Um, One named the main character Naruto Uzumaki, and then Sakue Uchiha and Salkina Harino. And I probably butchered those names, but I am so sorry. I'm not an expert in Japanese. Uh, but basically, a lot of what I remember, at least from this television show and its popularity, was the fact that I think it's sort of combining, again, some interesting elements because you got these three main characters and then the plot, at least the plots that happen. Um, and I think that's what largely stemmed a lot of people's interest in particular within this show. And again, it does have that kind of action-packed feel that you would expect, um, like from uh, Dragon Ball Z. Although I think, from what I can remember, I don't think I enjoyed the humor too much, at least from this particular show, from my experience with it. But I could understand why there would be people who would be really invested in this particular show, especially when they did have merchandise. And again, they did try to bring that whole Japanese like martial arts sort of like culture into the Western world. And you see that really prevalent within this show as well. Um, but I think it is a little bit less over the top again than Dragon Ball Z. It's a little bit more tame in that sense, but at the same time, it did try to play a little bit with comedy, and I don't think it really worked all too well. But at the same time, they did have some interesting, I guess, storylines and characters that really pulled the show sort of together, and that's why a lot of people, I think, got invested into it. And I think people liked the whole idea of, you know, these characters going through some kind of a training process of, sort of being kind of the new kids on the block, so to speak. So I can definitely understand that and why people thought that this was something that was interesting and unique. But I think that's really all I can really say about that show because that's really ultimately all I remember, at least about it, at least from my research and what I could gather from my brain. But next one that I wanted to briefly mention is Pokemon. I remember this show being so unbelievably popular. Like this was like, I mean, it was up there with popularity as far as Disney is concerned. I mean, it was something that everybody talked about non-stop. I just remember this being so in your face. It was probably, I would say it probably was on the level of Frozen for the hype. I mean, it was everywhere, and they had tons of merchandise based on this. They had cards, they had those little Pokeball things, they had all this different like merchandise, and um, they just really, really, really hammered in the whole marketing angle of it, which I think actually did make it a huge success. And the interesting thing about this show is it actually was based on a video game. Uh, and sort of revolves in a similar way to what you would expect from a video game. So I think, especially considering in this culture in particular, even starting off within the 90s when video games were starting to become fairly popular, I could understand why this kind of a television show would appeal to so many kids. But it was never really in my taste. I always thought that it was a little bit too weird for me. At points, I thought, the critters that they would create were a little bit cute, but then on the one hand, I felt it was a little bit gimmicky, even from the start, but it had a lot of relevancy and it seemed to maintain it. I think it's even actually still going on. Like, I think the Pokemon is actually still going on. Because I remember looking at the IMDb page and it said 1998 and it didn't have an ending point. So, well, regardless of whether or not you like this show or not, it's still going. Still got that dollars. But basically, it follows the story of this kid named Ash Ketchum. Sounds like ketchup, Ketchum. And his partner in crime, so to speak, Pikachu. And basically, they travel across various regions in hopes to be regarded sort of a Pokemon kind of champion master. And hence, kind of, you see the video game angle, the desire to win and be the number one. That's sort of Ash's goal. And in case anybody is unfamiliar with basically what Pokemon are, they're kind of like these creatures. I guess they classify them as monsters, but basically they're these creatures that you can catch. Hence the song, actually a really catchy song that I think was also a very brilliant marketing genius idea. Gotta catch 'em all, Pokemon, you catch the Pokemon and you use them to duke it out against other Pokemon players. And that's sort of what happens within the television show. Ash competes against all of these other Pokemon supposed masters or people that are good at playing the Pokemon or having good Pokemon. And basically the monsters compete against each other. And they're kept inside these balls, like these balls that you and then you throw them out there and say, I choose you, whatever your monster's name is. And so they kind of do all the work. Unless you count the catching them as the work. But that's kind of how the show really worked. It was designed to be kind of like this. It was supposed to largely be in a game. And you'll see how these kinds of villains end up showing up instead of kind of trying to intimidate Ash and, sort of take away his ability to kind of win, so to speak. So there's that angle too that I think some people at least remember. But and the thing that I think also is important to notice is that this concept is rather interesting. This whole idea of getting creatures to kind of fight against each other. It's not something that's all too common. And I think that's why a lot of kids kind of liked the idea, because it was kind of like having a friend. It was like kind of like having some kind of strategic advantage, and it was like it's like a game. So if you can warp a game into a show, you've got yourself a big a big reason into why I think a lot of people initially would get invested. Now, again, although I don't think, again, the show holds up all too well, at least from what I can tell, I can understand from a children's standpoint why it appeals to them and why they would like it. And again, it is a little bit more simplistic. It's not too complicated. It's not as in-depth as some other anime television shows. But I think the large reason why it appealed to kids was because of the fact that it was trying to get in on this whole kind of game angle of trying to make a show that largely primarily revolves around winning and getting Pokemon so you can use them to win a game. So I think that's really largely why why its marketing ultimately ended up working. And again, you get the Pokeballs, you know, you got the cards that they would use with the different monsters on them. And, you know, I just remember that being just so unbelievably popular. Like, that was the thing back in the day. So yeah, and although it did not appeal to me, I could understand why it appealed to so many. Um, but I think that's ultimately all I can say about that show. Now, last one that I'm going to mention is none other than Sailor Moon. um, Man, was this show popular. I mean, even among both genders, I think were largely invested in this show. Um, Boys, obviously, probably for different reasons than the girls, but Sailor Moon was interesting to say the least, even though it doesn't appeal to me. Again, this is a taste thing. It has nothing to do with, you know, I don't think that anything, you know, I think it has some interesting ideas, but again, anime just sometimes it just does two weird things for me. But regardless, I can understand its popularity. Um, and this was kind of a more girl focused show. And again, a lot of other anime shows primarily had, at least from what I could tell, male main characters. But here we have a main female character. She's annoying I mean, I don't want to say she's up there with someone like Drop Dead Fred, because she's not, but she's just a little bit too obnoxious for my taste, at least for a main character. I mean, I think she's just, if she was a side character, I think it would have been totally fine, but I mean, her as the main star, I mean, I just can't take it. um, but this show, I don't think is primarily popular because of her. I think it's primarily, at least from the time that it came out, I think it was popular was because of its whole concept, which was having all of these girl characters, including the Sailor Moon character, whose real name is Usagi, and basically, what these girls would end up doing is they would become these legendary warriors. Hence their various names. There was Sailor Moon, and then all these other planets, like, you know, and they would have, I guess, Sailor tied to them. So there would be like Sailor Venus, Sailor Jupiter, you know, there would be all these different girl characters that would have various names associated to planets. And basically, they would fight against the Dark Kingdom. So, and this Dark Kingdom has like various evil entities that they sort of battle against. And you know, and at the end of the day, you know, they save the day, save the world, whatnot. But again, I think the whole concept was what really did it for people with when it came to this television show, because the whole concept I think is great. Like these girls that they're these ordinary teenagers, and then they just change into these very elaborate and you know, larger than life kind of characters is what really I think sold people, and I think it sold it well, in particular for girls, and I think also for even boys to a certain extent as well, but for probably different reasons. Uh, but you know, that's, I think, again, why, you know, sometimes a concept, an idea can really sell people, and or at least get people to buy into the idea. And I think, you know, again, having largely the majority of characters be girls was also something that was kind of new. And it's not something that you see all too often with a lot of anime television shows. That it's usually, I think, fairly balanced. But in this one, it was primarily mostly estrogen in there. And although, again, like I've said before, I think largely, you know, Sailor Moon's character is the one that kind of throws me off from really enjoying the television show. I can really appreciate its concept. I think it's a great idea to have this kind of a setup where you have all of these girls sort of, working as a team to defeat a foe, which again is various foes. But I mean, even though we've seen this before, we don't see it done in such an elaborate way. And even the intro song is also one that's just great and enjoyable to watch, and is so elaborate and extensive, and it just works from that perspective. So again, I think the thing that I can say, at least from all these animes that I've been mentioning, is that I appreciate their ideas and their concepts more so than I actually appreciate the final products that they end up sort of producing, so to speak. So yeah, that's, I think, largely, from what I can tell as I'm explaining this list, that's, I think, largely my position on this kind of stuff. Um, and ultimately, though, I think that's really all I can say, at least about Sailor Moon and all of those other television shows that I've mentioned. But again, I totally understand if there's people who are really devoted into these television shows, and I can understand the appeal. I guess I can just say from my perspective, I appreciate what they're trying to do, more so than I genuinely like the final way in which they're all executed. But again, they do bring up some interesting ideas. There are some very wacky concepts that they offer, and it is creative. It is interesting, to say the least. But and I think I can say I do have appreciation for it. I think it's great that anime exists. But again, just something that I would consider devoting my entire time and energy to is just it's just something that I'm really not invested in doing. But I think it's interesting to see, at least from my perspective and from what I remember as a kid, what shows in particular anime that were popular and were really well recognized. And I think these particular 5 shows were the ones that got the most airtime and got the most exposure, got the most marketing, uh, and seemed to remain fairly prominent, at least throughout um, my childhood. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say when it comes to this particular list. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. Feel free to let me know your questions, comments, concerns. I would be more than happy to answer them. But until next time, everybody.